Hello everybody, welcome to this Green live discussion event here tonight. We're talking about the future of Mossmorran. My name is Mark Ruskell, Green Party MSP from Mid-Scotland and Fife, and we've just had a debate, I think a really useful debate in the Scottish Parliament about what the future Mossmorran plant looks like, how we get a just transition for workers and communities, and to tackle climate change as well. And I'm joined this evening with James Glenn from Mossmorran Action Group, representing the community. I've also got Niamh McNulty from Climate Camp Scotland and Ryan Morrison from Friends of the Earth Scotland. And I'm going to ask for their reactions about the debate and some of the issues that were raised tonight. But also is a good opportunity for you listening at home to feed in your own thoughts and ideas and questions to the panel, and we can get a good discussion going. And we've already had a few questions come in, so I'll turn to those in a minute. But yeah, this event tonight is part of a regular series that the Greens organise, and it's on live.greens.scot. But it's also on the SGP Facebook page as well, and on Twitter. So do keep a lookout for these events. We'll be doing a lot more of them going forward. Okay, so perhaps then if I could start with James Glenn from Mossmorran Action Group. James, what were your thoughts about the debate tonight and the contributions that you heard from different parties?
Hi, Mark. Hi, Mark. I don't know if you can hear us. I'll just assume that people can hear us.
Yeah, fine.
I felt those the MSPs are quite well informed, and so obviously the Scottish Government is well aware of the impacts on the communities. And I was positive to see so much support coming out for the residents that have been impacted, but very disappointing that once again the Scottish Government are hiding behind regulations and SEPA. And really, this has been a long-term issue where the Scottish Government is not taking the issues of the residents seriously.
Yeah, thanks for that. Niamh, what was your perspective on what you heard today?
Yeah, I think overall it was really positive, and I thank you for bringing it to the debate. I was quite surprised to see the Tory member showing support for a just transition, but I would also question whether they mentioned focusing on industry interests quite a lot, and so I question if maybe all members have like a full understanding of what a just transition might mean. And I was really supportive of seeing the SNP local MSP Annabel Ewing taking strong support for her constituents and kind of breaking with the party line a bit there, whereas the government response seemed a bit, nice platitudes, but a bit empty.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, there was definitely a real kind of shift. I mean, I said at the beginning, it would have been a debate that would have been very hard to have years ago. But there seemed to be an acceptance in the room that Mossmorran maybe could close in the future, which I think is a major step forward. Ryan, what were your thoughts on what you heard tonight?
Yeah, I don't think anything too dissimilar from what we've heard from Niamh and James. I think it was an excellent motion to begin with, and I think the one thing I'd maybe add is that the fact that beyond the Scottish Government, we were able to see cross-party support, including Annabel Ewing from the SNP, is probably a sign of particularly the campaign work that's being done by the local community, by the environmental movement and others to really bring this to the centre. I think it's really obvious that these MSPs are aware of the pressure and aware of what the demands are, and that shows in the debate.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely a shift of mood in the community in recent years as well. James, you want to give us a bit of background as to how you think that's built up over the last couple of years? Because you've very much been at the thick of it.
Well, really, it's been a campaign born out of frustration from residents. For years, we've been calling on action, and as individuals, when I was a member of Logella Community Council, it was quite an issue at the forefront, daily impacting on residents' lives. Yet the issue was always getting sidelined. And it's only been recently that there's been a momentum between the community coming together and actually sharing publicly the impacts that they're facing through their social impact map. I think that helped build some steam for the campaign. Then, of course, the work you've been doing yourself, Mark, publicly and also in the background has helped keep this on the political table. But it's a campaign that's just been born out of frustration due to the ongoing impacts from flaring events, but we mustn't get complacent either, because there is an impact there on a day-to-day basis from chemical smells in the area, and also there's just a constant noise pollution from the area. It's just more bearable when they aren't flaring. But again, it's completely born out of frustration, this campaign, and thanks to yourselves and groups like Climate Camp Scotland, it's helped take it more to the forefront, to the sort of the centre of the Scottish Government. But unfortunately, they're still refusing to act.
So maybe we could just sort of drill into that a bit more then. I mean, what more do you think government should be doing? You heard what the Minister had to say early on. Obviously, there are legal proceedings now against the operators of Mossmorran for breaching, the law in relation to SEPA. That's taking its course. That's being investigated. There's been a report gone to the Crown Office. What more do you think government should be doing at this point? James, I can go back to you on that, and then I'll maybe sort of come around to others and get your view as well.
Well, I'll keep it quick. One thing I would like to say about the government saying that they don't want to interfere again in this sort of the court proceedings. This is a constant new excuse used by the Scottish Government. And the fact is, SEPA sometimes has multiple investigations into the plant. There will always be some form of ongoing investigation, whether it's legal action or SEPA's internal reviews or investigations by HSE. So it's a complete whitewash, the excuse that the government's using. What I think residents would at least like to see is for the ministers to come to a public meeting and actually speak firsthand with the residents, but they don't have the basic decency to even directly engage with residents. And that'd be a very small step for them to take that is very feasible. They don't have to talk, so no opinion then can interfere with any legal action. It's as a start and see where we can take it from.
Yeah, Niamh, what do you think government should be doing more of?
Yeah, I think I would agree with everything that James just said. And I also think they need to stop with this. What did the Scottish Government Minister say? That they were the vanguard of climate action. Which I just thought was ridiculous. I mean, it's people in the communities like James and stuff who are really leading this movement. It's just grassroots organizations. So for me, they need to stop hiding behind their progressive image and saying that, oh, that image, that identity is enough. I need to start taking serious action in terms of even things. Obviously, the flare tip is welcome in terms of the immediate impact that it'll have on reducing the impacts of the flaring. But really, that's just a sticker over a festering wound. That plant is then going to run for further years. It's getting so much more investment. So it's going to be running for longer, and just the climate impacts of that and the community impacts in that are just going to really double down. So yeah, they need to be taking a much more long-term approach, which has much more urgency and focuses less on false solutions. As you said in the debate about carbon capture storage, and things like that, all these really unproven things. We don't have time to be focusing on these uncertainties. The precautionary principle would really say we need to just be acting now with what we know. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Ryan, would you agree with Neve on that? Are there other things the government could be doing right now?
Yeah, I think definitely, and I think it really, the sort of contribution from the minister sort of encapsulates this broader challenge with a government that's really able to use the right language and the right terms as and when they think it suits, but they are far slower to turn any of that rhetoric into action. And I think on top of what Neve was talking about, there was a few things that the minister spoke about as part of a sort of mission for green jobs that, like, I think it's really worth like drilling into a little bit, because it can make for a good headline, and then ultimately when you start to pour through some of the detail, it doesn't really stump up to much. And I think, like, for instance, we heard about the Energy Transition Fund as something that will support a just transition, but one of my colleagues, Jess at Friends of the Earth, carried out a Freedom of Information request and showed that there's no conditionality on that fund. There's no requirements for companies to commit to retaining jobs or creating new jobs. There's no conditionality for decarbonisation. It's effectively just going to be a handout to some of the industry bodies. I think, as well as that, we heard from the minister about the programme for government and the Greens Jobs mission again, and this Greens Job Fund, and then 100,000 jobs that we're going to see through an inward investment plan. Like, once you start to look at the detail of this, it's the same approach that has so far not paid off. We've not seen the level of jobs that we've heard of before that are necessary to make a just transition happen. And the Scottish Government is continuing down the same approach, using the same language, making big promises on jobs without tackling any of the structural problems that have been pointed out repeatedly. And then I think the last one, which for me was the most frustrating, is the Just Transition Commission. Because I think in a conversation about why there ought to be a Just Transition Board for Mossmorran, for the Scottish Government to talk about the merits of the Just Transition Commission is a real frustrating one, because the Commission has made 2 sets of recommendations already. It made an interim report in February this year. It provided advice on green recovery, and in both occasions, it asked the Scottish Government to respond immediately, to make policy commitments to the things that it said. And we've still not had a response from the Scottish Government to whether or not they're going to carry out the recommendations made. So you're kind of talking, like, we're hearing the minister talking about why the Just Transition Commission is evidence of this great commitment to just transition, when we're sitting with a stack of recommendations from a body it created not being taken forward.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to do, isn't there? We've had a comment actually, a question actually from Mike Small at Bella Caledonia on Facebook. And he asks, can you see a situation after COVID where we have a permanent protest camp outside Mossmorran? I think we need direct action as well as parliamentary pressure. Neve, have you got a warm sleeping bag?
I still need to buy my sleeping bag. But yeah, maybe we had planned for, was it June or July past, to have a camp near Mossmorran somewhere. Obviously that didn't pan out because of COVID. And we weren't sure what was going to happen. But definitely we've been working with Mossmorran Action Group, looking to begin building relationships with workers across Scotland affected by fossil fuel industry and the lack of a just transition, looking to hold some big direct action maybe next year, whether that's like a week's camp, maybe not a permanent camp, we see, but there are definitely ways. Even we've seen Enda Galenda this week with amazing plans, really good safety protocol for their occupation of coal mines and stuff in Germany. So yeah, there's lots of learning to be done there, and I think Mike is definitely right. Direct action is something that's needed, and it's definitely something that like average people can get involved in. That shows, we definitely have power to do this. If the government's not going to do something, if the government's sitting behind their empty words, like, we're going to do it. And like, we have the ability to build relationships amongst ourselves and create the future we want. So I would invite Mike to come along if he wants.
Great, there you go, Mike. That's a challenge for you if you're listening in. James, can I come back to you then and ask you about what a just transition looks like from the perspective of Mossmorran Action Group? I mean, this is a really sensitive issue. We're all concerned about climate change, and and the future of the planet, but we are talking about communities, we're talking about people's jobs and livelihoods. And I think the tone of that debate and the solutions that we put forward are really important. So what do you think a just transition looks like, particularly from the perspective of the local communities?
Well, I think for the local communities, I think a just transition is actually talking about a plan for the closure of Mossmorran and have it that blight removed from our communities. In terms of local jobs, there will be some lower skilled jobs in the area, but the people who will be involved in the just transition for them in Kenbeath and Logelly in the main, they prefer to live in communities away from the danger zone, so to speak. And it would just be a minority workers, so that just transition doesn't really have a direct impact on communities like Logelly and Kenbeath. So for the residents that are upset at Mossmorran, just transitions for them is actually talking about a plan for closing Mossmorran down. And probably if you took a poll in the street, the sooner the better it would be for some.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the mood that you get at public meetings where people are really struggling to get to sleep at night and their quality of life is really impacted. So I understand that local perspective, but Ryan, what does just transition for Mossmorran look like in essence from the Friends of the Earth perspective?
I mean, I think there are a few things, and it's kind of about the way we view what a just transition is more generally, and it's something that needs to play out at the national level, but where there are these particularly large pieces of infrastructure that need to be phased out, like there is a real need for them to be planned locally as well. And I think when we talk about just transition, we're looking at something that works and is fair to workers and their trade unions, its communities, and it's also the environment, because we need to operate within climate limits. And I think, as James said, that means a managed phase out of the site. And I think what's then important is sort of less for me to be able to say what I think that looks like for Mossmorran and for the people that live around it, but actually a just transition for me will look like the workers and communities being able to actively guide that process, and then not only guiding the process of phase out and transition, but in the long run, building towards something where the workers and communities have a greater say in the economy that exists around them in the future, because we can't end up back in a situation where we have these multinational companies who are able to ignore the wishes of a local community. We need to have something far closer with far more work.
Yeah, so very much a worker-led transition. Niamh, would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I just repeat everything that James and Ryan just said. All this talk about having all the stakeholders around the table, I am just like a bit skeptical of the idea that like there's an equal power dynamic between communities and like, the bosses of like Exxon and Shell and the government. That's not like everybody having an equal say. And I think, the workers need to say how the managed phase out happens. The workers need to say what comes next, what happens on that site. It's really like their home, that's their environment that they live in, and that's really important. The only thing I would add, and this is just from my personal perspective, so obviously I don't want to be speaking for workers or anything, but something that's really important to just transition is that we don't then shut down the plant and then that plant gets exported to somewhere in the global south and we're carrying our emissions in across the world. It's so unjust. It like reeks of like neocolonialism. And it's so bad for the environment. So I think that just transition also really needs to have the internationalist perspective as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, particularly when we come up to COP26 as well, I think that inequality and injustice around the world is going to be really, really laid bare when we get into COP26 next year. Ryan, we're talking there about workers. I mean, you've produced a report today alongside Greenpeace and Platform. It got mentioned a few times in the debate this evening, which is great. But that's a survey of what workers feel about the jobs that they could go into, about reskilling and a whole range of other issues. Do you want to give us an outline of what that report covers?
Yeah, I mean, it was great to see it picked up in the Parliament, given it was referenced. It was only released today. I think what we did with Platform and Greenpeace was a survey of offshore oil and gas workers, and we heard from 1,383 workers, and we did ask them about the transition to renewables and what they might want to see from that, but we also asked them about their lives and experiences of working in the industry more generally. And I think it would be unsurprising, perhaps, that recently, given everything that's going on, there's been a huge increase in redundancies and furlough. But actually what we heard across a far longer period of time was just a real sense of precarious work, of pay cuts, of just a real treatment as a commodity by the oil and gas industry for these workers, and actually just a palpable exhaustion with it, like really fed up. And then I think what we also seen was a huge appetite to move into something new. I think 81% of the people we spoke to said they would be interested in moving to another industry out with oil and gas. Over half of their first pick was offshore wind, but they were also interested in renewables and decommissioning. And then we also asked them what their solutions for that were. So we didn't want to just know, would you be interested in it? Like, I think, as Niamh said, these workers know their industry inside out. They know how everything works. And if you need to understand how you make a transition practically happen, then they're the best people to ask. And what we inevitably found was that they did have lots of solutions, and they were already aware of the kind of barriers that were holding them back from moving to other jobs. And they spoke to us about sort of parasitic retraining programs where you do a course to go offshore oil and gas on safety. It costs you thousands of pounds. If you want to go for offshore wind, it's practically the same course, but you're going to be shelling out another few £1,000s to do that. And it's just different bodies taking advantage of these workers, who are then also the same people who are treated like a commodity at the time when any sort of boom and bust cycle comes around again. And they were fed up with it. I think the reason we did it was kind of going back to the conversation we were having before about just transition, and like, who owns that term, and what does it mean to people? And I think Niamh mentioned this as well, like we are at risk of seeing just transition be kind of lost to some industry voices. You mentioned that in the debate, Mark, and I think it's really important that community groups, workers, environmentalists, trade unions are all really dominating that narrative, because ultimately it's those groups that have to define what is just in the transition.
Yeah, so some really important information and lessons to be learned from that report. Where do you see the conclusions of that report going next then? How do you want to see that feed into the way that these decarbonisation funds are being set up and the way that government's working?
I think for us writing the report, what we are looking for is that the government, Scottish government, the UK government, makes really clear commitments to engaging in participatory policy making with these groups, with workers, to make sure that it's not only effective but that it's fair. And I think what we're looking to do now is a next step, because I have my doubts that we'll see that response from the government. So what we're looking to do ourselves, as the people that wrote the report, is actually try and make some of that space on our own with other groups. And so what we're asking is for other people who work in the oil and gas industry, other local communities, like people around Mossmorran, but also people in the northeast around Aberdeen, to get in touch, to join us in this process, so that we can craft the solutions to this that we can then take to government and say, you literally cannot ignore this. We are here and demanding it.
Yeah, excellent. So James, what do you see as the next steps in your campaign, which is very locally focused? What sort of changes to the community want to see next? I mean, you are going to get a kind of new liaison group with an expanded remit that was spoken a bit about tonight, but beyond that, what do you see the next steps being?
Well, we'll obviously keep on continuing campaigning. I would like to mention about this reformed community liaison group. For decades, it's been running really, really poorly. And sorry, my battery's about to go. Decades, it's been running really, really poorly, and this reformation was supposed to be a positive step forward. But all we've actually seen is the community's still been excluded, and they're just shining the group up. It was the Mossmorran Action Group that pushed for this reform, and we've been left out of the process completely now. And they think they've got it back under control, and where it'll be thanks. Again, and we've been completely excluded from that process and excluded from the group. So again, we're still at square one with all this process. So we just have to keep on pushing and highlighting the flaws in their accountability and transparency at the Fife Council level, but also at the local politician level, as well as try to get greater reform coming in from the Scottish Government. So we'll be doing this campaign. As Niamh said earlier, Ken, there's a lot of lip service coming from the government. And so we're just going to have to keep on pushing against that narrative. And that is, like Ryan says, we're going to have to show a project and go, this is what the people are demanding, and it's time for the Scottish Government to take action on it.
So I didn't realise that there were so many issues with the new liaison group, and I think that's really disappointing to hear. And it just shows, like with any environmental campaign, how you need to fight it on so many different fronts, from the local through to the global. Niamh, what's your focus then? I mean, it's an exciting year now, the run up to COP26. I think people globally are going to be demanding change. How do you think you can highlight the need for just transition and climate action in this country, and hopefully show the way for other industrialized countries as well?
Yeah, so obviously Corona put quite the spanners in our works. We're just building back up now, and we'll continue working with groups like Mossmorran Action Group and strategizing about the best way to really clearly communicate to the public, to the government, to the industry, what's the problem with this and how do we move forward, and really shifting the narrative away from, it's you with your plastic fork and because you didn't buy, you know what I mean? And to you can buy as many sporks as you want, and Exxon and Shell are still going to be spouting the gases into the air. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, hopefully we'll be shifting the narrative that way and building some community resilience. We have some great people working on movement building and stuff. It all seems a bit vague just now, but I have good hopes that the environmentalist movement is making good strides in Scotland towards having a more justice oriented lens. So I'm quite hopeful.
Yeah, and there seems to be a real interest at the moment in kind of more deliberative types of democracy, citizens' assemblies, getting ordinary people together with experts, thinking through what the solutions are. Do you think that's something that we can see more of, possibly online, but more of in the run up to COP26?
Possibly. That's not something I've been doing much work on. I know XR have been doing a lot more work on that. But yeah, I think so. I think it's really important that, as people making these decisions, and yeah, that we're creating these spaces to decide our own future ourselves. So I think something I'd be skeptical about is, even though it's very welcome that the Scottish Government take on things like a Climate Citizens Assembly, they take on the sort of wording that was suggested by environmental campaigners for their questioning. I am still skeptical of the government having the main stake in that, the government having the main lead in that. And I think really participatory politics, like we've been saying, needs to be led by workers, by communities, by those with the most vested interests. And the idea that the state or the government, the companies, or the people with the most vested interests in that is just something that needs to be rid from our minds. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think we're drawing to a close now, but maybe just one final question. I think it's back to, the politicians that inhabit this place, the Scottish Parliament, and really what do you want us to do? what are the top actions now that we need to take forward to deliver this just transition? So who wants to go first? Ryan?
I mean, it's a massive question. I can think of no one single thing that could do it, but I think the main change, like step change, that I really want to see and that we haven't seen yet is just a reprioritization of who matters in this conversation and what we're valuing in a just transition. It's depending on who is having a look in, they might find that they want to define just transition in their terms. We see that from industry groups, a real capture of what it means. But ultimately, like I would really like to see everyone in the Parliament rallying behind something that is much more focused on the people at the sharp end, but also on the environmental impacts of what we're doing.
Message understood. Niamh, what are your top actions for the politicians?
Yeah, it's a very big question. I'm like, oh, I don't know. Was something the Scottish minister brought up, the Scottish Government minister, was that this idea of sustainable growth. And I think this idea that like economic growth and sustainability are compatible, that needs to, you know, move beyond this idea of some like nice platitudes about a well-being economy and into like a real like process, like analysis of like, what does that mean on the ground materially to like separate like our economic growth from our targets. And, you know, even these ideas of net zero, I think that's something I would like to see us moving away from, because the idea of net zero even still relies on implicitly the idea that we can extract things if we're offsetting things elsewhere. And, you know, that has a lot of problems in terms of like delayed gratification of like the actual carbon reduction. And yeah, I would like these sorts of sustainability questions answered.
There's a really big agenda there to unpack, and I think one of the issues we've been getting head around in the Scottish Parliament and the Greens is not just about carbon targets, but also about consumption targets, because we can sort our own domestic emissions because we've got those renewables, but we're actually still buying stuff and importing stuff from around the world, and obviously that's creating injustice as well. So we're not there yet. We don't yet have the right metrics and the right objectives in many ways. James, a final comment from you then as to what you think we should be doing.
Well, I'd say for politicians like yourself, Mark, and Alex Rowley and Alexander Stewart, I think continuously raising the issue on behalf of communities for the Mossmorran, and I'm aware that you do other areas as well. I think that's very, very important and helpful, and does give some hope to residents that they're actually being listened to. As for the Scottish Government, I'm very concerned that a lot of it's just lip service. And I agree with Niamh that there needs to be a slight cultural change in the way we buy products. If we end up taking the profits away from these companies by changing their spending habits, that can help in the just transition process. And as Ryan says, there needs to be a reprioritisation of who the people are that are leading these just transition talks. And my worry is that the Scottish Government, at the end of the day, is just looking solely at the economic value and listening to the big oil companies like ExxonMobil and Shell. So we'd like to see these Scottish Government ministers actually come out of their Holyrood bubble and meet directly with residents around Grangemouth, around Mossmorran, and all the other petrochemical plants in the area, or for other polluting industries. There's issues with the salmon farming going on at the moment. And ministers are just deflecting and always hiding behind SEPA and other regulatory bodies that should be discussing these issues directly with communities and listening to the communities, but also having that conversation directly with workers, rather than letting the interests of big oil and these big environmental polluters lead the conversation.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And we know that, you know, thousands of people have written to the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Rosanna Cunningham, asking her, pleading with her to come to Lochgelly and the surrounding communities and meet with people who are really suffering, and they've just continually ducked that. But yeah, I think the consensus tonight around some form of just transition board. I think, it could be lots of different types of board, being driven by the operators or driven by workers or whatever. But I think there's something there. There's something there for us to say, this is really now the time to take this conversation into the community with the workers and actually have this discussion, and how we do that and what the consensus behind that will be interesting. Okay, look, thanks very much for joining me tonight here, Niamh, James and Ryan. There's been a Green Live event. We do these quite often, and certainly you can go back and listen to this discussion, as indeed you can go back and listen to the debate that took place tonight in Parliament as well, online, and we'll be certainly promoting that in the weeks to come. So hopefully this will have a good reach, and it will hopefully provoke some discussion and debate within the community about how we get a just transition going forward. So thanks very much for joining me here tonight, and yeah, I'll hopefully see you again very soon. Bye.